The history of Moscow within the Russian imperial framework of the 19th century operated through a series of unexpected jurisdictional anomalies that distinguished the city from the surrounding provinces. Unlike the vast territories of Russia, where residency was governed by broad territorial statutes, Moscow was subject to the Moscow exception, a regulatory paradigm where Jewish presence was managed through individual executive permits rather than collective rights. This administrative architecture was rooted in the 1828 and 1835 imperial statutes, which designated Moscow as a forbidden center for the majority of the empire's non-Orthodox subjects, establishing a default state of exclusion. Under this regime, the right to dwell within the city limits was classified as a temporary privilege, a precarious legal category that could be revoked at any time by the discretion of the Governor-General or the Ministry of the Interior. This system created a profound disconnect between the central government's general legislative trends and the specific, localized police regulations enforced within the ancient capital. The legal mechanism of pripiska, or registration, served as the primary instrument for controlling the city's demographic composition. To secure even a temporary residency stamp, an individual had to satisfy a rigorous hierarchy of professional and fiscal criteria that were subject to constant revision by the imperial chancellery. This meant that the Jewish population in Moscow did not exist as a singular legal entity, but rather as a fragmented collection of professional categories, each with varying degrees of vulnerability. The city's administration utilized the artisan certificates and merchant guild licenses as surveillance tools, ensuring that any person whose economic utility diminished would automatically lose their legal standing. Furthermore, the 1856 and 1860 decrees introduced by the Petrine-style bureaucracy attempted to standardize these exceptions, yet they paradoxically increased the administrative rigidity by requiring exhaustive documentation for every household member. By the 1880s, the legal standing of Moscow's Jewish residents was further complicated by the administrative discretionary power granted to the city's police apparatus. This power allowed officials to bypass the traditional judicial reviews of the Senate, enabling the summary cancellation of residency rights based on untrustworthiness or security concerns. The legal reality was one of perpetual uncertainty, where a valid passport from a borderland province held no weight within the Moscow municipal jurisdiction without a specific city-sanctioned endorsement. The right of residence was effectively treated as a state-owned commodity, leased to specific individuals for the duration of their recognized service to the imperial economy. This structural fragility ensured that the Jewish community remained legally isolated from the broader Russian citizenry, existing within a state of permitted transit that lacked any constitutional or hereditary protection. Consequently, Moscow functioned as a zone of intense administrative scrutiny, where the absence of a permanent legal anchor made the entire community susceptible to the shifting ideological winds of the Romanov court. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The origins of the territorial confinement that defined the 19th century Jewish experience in Russia are rooted in the 1791 decree of Catherine II, which established the Pale of Settlement as a permanent legislative boundary. This policy was a direct consequence of the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which incorporated large, established Jewish populations into a Russian state that had previously maintained a de facto policy of total exclusion. The decree of December 23, 1791, specifically restricted Jewish residency to the newly annexed Western Gubernias and the southern territories of New Russia, thereby creating a legal partition between the imperial interior and the frontier. By designating these specific regions as the only zones of legitimate habitation, the Romanov administration institutionalized the concept of Cherta Osiedlosti, or a demographic demarcation line, which fundamentally transformed the geography of the empire into permitted and prohibited spaces. Moscow, as the historical and spiritual center of the Russian heartland, sat unequivocally outside this legislative perimeter, serving as the primary benchmark for territorial exclusion. The 1804 statute concerning the organization of the Jews further refined this boundary, articulating that the inner provinces of Great Russia were to remain a closed jurisdiction. This statute introduced the principle of negative residency, where the absence of an explicit right to inhabit a territory was interpreted by the provincial chanceries as an absolute prohibition. Consequently, the Pale was not merely a zone of containment for the Western populations, but a structural barrier designed to insulate the metropolitan centers from the diverse socio-economic structures of the borderlands. The legal terminology of the era defined the interior as Vnutrenie Gubernii, a designation that carried with it a requirement for confessional and social homogeneity that the state believed would be compromised by the influx of non-Orthodox merchant classes. The precedent set by the 1791 decree established a dual-track legal system where citizenship and residency were decoupled. While other imperial subjects moved within the framework of the soslovai, or estate system, the Jewish population was governed by special laws that overrode general civil protections. The Ministry of State Domains and the Ministry of Finance utilized these geographic constraints to ensure that competition between the emerging Russian merchantry and the Jewish commercial networks was neutralized through physical separation. This territorial containment was reinforced by the 1835 General Code, which explicitly barred Jewish subjects from acquiring real estate or holding municipal office outside the designated Pale. By the mid-19th century, this legacy of exclusion had created a deep-seated administrative habit of viewing any Jewish presence in Moscow as a deviation from the natural order of the state. The Pale thus functioned as a conceptual filter where only those who could prove exceptional state utility were granted the temporary right to bypass the frontier and enter the holy Russian interior. This historical inertia provided the Romanov bureaucracy with a ready-made ideological framework to justify the mass displacements that would be enacted decades later. The accession of Alexander II in 1855 initiated a fundamental reevaluation of the empire's demographic policies, shifting the state's objective from total isolation to selective integration. This era, often characterized as a period of great reforms, sought to modernize the Russian economy by utilizing the intellectual and financial resources of specific, useful categories of the Jewish population. The primary legislative breakthrough occurred through the decree of March 16, 1859, which granted merchants of the First Guild the right of permanent residency and the acquisition of real estate in the interior provinces, including Moscow. This was followed by the 1861 and 1865 statutes, which extended these privileges to university graduates holding candidate or doctoral degrees, as well as to certified medical practitioners and pharmacists. By legalizing the presence of these elite classes, the Romanov administration aimed to foster a loyal, Russified intelligentsia that would bridge the gap between the Western Pale and the imperial center. The mechanism of this reform was rooted in the concept of sliani, or merger, where the state provided legal incentives for acculturation and professional excellence. Unlike the previous era of forced Cantonist recruitment, the Alexandrian reforms utilized the Ministry of Public Education and the Ministry of Finance as the primary architects of social engineering. The 1867 decree further expanded these rights to include discharged soldiers who had completed their full term of service, creating a diverse demographic of Jewish residents in Moscow who operated outside the traditional Kahal structures. These individuals were permitted to enter the civil service and join the municipal merchant guilds, effectively integrating them into the third estate of the city. This policy did not abolish the Pale, but rather created a specialized legal corridor for those whose technical expertise or capital reserves were deemed essential for the post-Crimean War industrialization. However, the reformist mirage remained contingent upon the individual's continued adherence to their professional status, as the right of residency was legally tethered to the certificate of service or guild membership. The imperial chancellery maintained a strict status requirement, whereby the loss of a professional license or the cessation of a business venture could theoretically result in the immediate expiration of the residency permit. Despite this precariousness, the population of Jewish residents in Moscow grew significantly during the 1860s and 1870s, establishing the cultural and economic foundations of the Zaryadye and other urban districts. The state's reliance on these useful subjects created an unprecedented degree of social mobility, as the younger generation utilized the 1874 Universal Military Service Act and university quotas to secure a place within the Russian professional class. This period represented a temporary suspension of the isolationist dogma, fostering a belief among the integrated elite that the barriers of the Pale were being permanently dismantled by the march of progress. Yet, this legal relaxation was not anchored in a constitutional framework, leaving the newly acquired rights vulnerable to the administrative whims of a future, more reactionary throne. The 1860s reforms thus established a fragile coexistence that relied on the pragmatic self-interest of the monarch rather than a genuine shift in the empire's theological or social outlook. The detonation of the Narodnaya Volya bomb on March 1, 1881, which resulted in the assassination of Alexander II, served as the definitive terminal point for the era of selective integration. The transition of executive authority to Alexander III immediately empowered a conservative bloc within the imperial administration that viewed the previous decades of legislative relaxation as a fundamental threat to the autocratic structure. This shift was characterized by the rise of reactionary nationalism, an ideological movement that sought to define Russian identity through the triad of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Within this new political environment, the Jewish population particularly the urbanized elite residing in Moscow, was repositioned from useful subjects to alien elements whose presence in the imperial heartland was increasingly scrutinized as a source of revolutionary contagion and social destabilization. The immediate legislative response to the regicide was the Manifesto on Unshakable Autocracy, issued in April 1881, which signaled a retreat from Western-style legalism in favor of centralized police oversight. The imperial court, influenced by high-ranking officials such as Count Nikolai Ignatiev, began to categorize Jewish economic and intellectual activity as a destabilizing force that exploited the native Russian population. This period saw the formalization of the Jewish question as a primary concern of internal security, leading to the establishment of the High Commission for the Review of the Jewish Laws. Unlike the reformist commissions of the 1860s, this body operated under the assumption that the integrationist experiment had failed and that the state must reestablish the rigid boundaries of the Pale of Settlement to protect the agrarian core of the empire. The socio-political climate was further inflamed by the outbreak of the 1881-1882 pogroms in the southern and western provinces, which the central government interpreted not as a failure of order but as a natural reaction of the peasantry against economic exploitation. While Moscow did not experience large-scale street violence during this interval, the administrative atmosphere within the city became overtly hostile. The Moscow Okhrana and the Governor General's office began to conflate Jewish residency with political subversion, utilizing the presence of a few Jewish radicals in the revolutionary underground to justify a blanket suspicion of the entire community. This led to the introduction of provisional emergency measures, which granted city officials the authority to bypass traditional civil protocols when investigating the validity of residency permits. By late 1881, the Romanov administration had shifted its fiscal and social priorities toward national protectionism, a policy that favored the traditional Orthodox gosti and artisans over the more competitive Jewish merchantry. The Ministry of the Interior began drafting guidelines that effectively paused the issuance of new residency rights to First Guild merchants, signaling the end of the legal expansion initiated 2 decades prior. This reactionary turn was not merely a response to the assassination, but a systemic rejection of the multi-confessional model of empire building. The state's new objective was the restoration of a mythic Russian homogeneity, an ideological project that required the identification and eventual removal of groups deemed un-Russian. The 1881 catalyst thus transformed the legal status of Moscow's Jewish residents from a managed exception into a strategic target for upcoming state-sanctioned displacement. The theological substantiation for the impending demographic shifts in Moscow was largely articulated through the office of Konstantin Pobedonostsev, the procurator of the Holy Synod and a principal advisor to the Romanov throne. Under his tenure, the Holy Synod transitioned from a purely ecclesiastical body into a proactive architect of imperial social policy, operating on the premise that the spiritual integrity of the Russian Orthodox Church was inextricably linked to the preservation of the autocratic state. Pobedonostsev's political philosophy, detailed in his Reflections of a Russian Statesman, rejected the legalistic pluralism of Western Europe, advocating instead for a monolithic empire where religious dissent was categorized as a form of political treason. This ideological framework transformed the presence of non-Orthodox populations in the Russian heartland into a matter of ecclesiastical security, providing the state with a moral imperative to pursue policies of segregation and eventual exclusion. The Holy Synod utilized its extensive network of parish clergy and diocesan chanceries to monitor the spiritual health of the metropolitan centers, frequently submitting reports to the Ministry of the Interior regarding the perceived influence of Jewish intellectualism on the Orthodox laity. By the late 1880s, the Synod began to champion the concept of religious homogeneity as a prerequisite for national loyalty, arguing that the diverse urban fabric of Moscow was a byproduct of harmful cosmopolitanism. This movement sought the rigid enforcement of the Code of Ecclesiastical Laws, which prohibited the public exercise of non-Christian faiths in historically significant Russian locales. The Synod's influence was instrumental in the 1886 decision to restrict the construction and expansion of synagogues in the interior gubernias, a measure intended to signal that the state no longer recognized the permanent communal rights of non-baptized subjects. Furthermore, Pobedonosttsev's influence extended into the Committee of Ministers, where he consistently argued that the Judaization of the Russian economy was a structural obstacle to the fulfillment of the empire's divine mission. He promoted a policy of forced marginalization, whereby the legal and social barriers of the state were used to incentivize conversion or emigration. The Holy Synod provided the administrative justification for the numerus clausus, the system of educational quotas that limited Jewish enrollment in state secondary schools and universities, framing it as a defensive measure to protect Orthodox youth from alien ideological contamination. This educational restriction was not merely an academic policy, but a strategic effort to dismantle the professional bridge that had allowed Jewish families to settle in Moscow during the previous reign. The Pobedonostsev era also saw the professionalization of ecclesiastical censorship, which targeted Jewish publications and Hebrew printing presses, effectively isolating the Moscow community from the broader cultural discourse of the Pale. The Synod's rhetoric equated the Russian soul with a specific theological adherence, creating a legal environment where full citizenship was increasingly contingent upon baptism. By 1890, this drive for uniformity had successfully marginalized the integrationist factions within the Russian bureaucracy, leaving the Governor-General's office in Moscow with a clear ideological mandate for total displacement. The influence of the Holy Synod ensured that the upcoming expulsion would be framed not as a fiscal or police action, but as a pious purification of the ancient capital, aligning the Romanov state with the mythic traditions of Muscovite isolationism. This synthesis of church and state provided the final psychological preparation for the April 26 mandate, confirming that in the eyes of the autocracy, social utility could never supersede the requirement for confessional alignment. The promulgation of the temporary regulations regarding the Jews on May 3, 1882, fundamentally reconfigured the legal parameters of Jewish existence within the Russian Empire. While ostensibly temporary, these mandates, collectively known as the May Laws, remained the cornerstone of imperial restrictive policy for over 3 decades, serving as the primary mechanism for the demographic compression of the urban centers. The legislative intent as articulated by the Ministry of Interior under Count Ignatiev, was to arrest the expansion of the Jewish middle class and to physically isolate the community from the rural Orthodox population. Although the primary focus of the 1882 decree was the prohibition of new settlement in rural districts within the Pale, its administrative repercussions in Moscow were immediate and profound, as the city's municipal authorities utilized the provisional nature of the laws to initiate a systematic audit of all existing residency permits. A critical provision of the May laws involved the prohibition of all commercial activities on Sundays and major Christian holidays, a measure that directly targeted the competitive edge of Jewish retail and artisan networks. This legislative intervention into the calendar of commerce was intended to align the marketplace with the liturgical requirements of the state church, effectively imposing a mandatory day of inactivity on non-Christian businesses. In Moscow, the enforcement of these regulations was managed by the Gubernskoye Pravlenie, or provincial board, which conducted rigorous inspections of the Zaryadye trading rows to ensure total compliance. Furthermore, the 1882 regulations restricted the right of Jewish residents to enter into new mortgage agreements or leasehold contracts for agricultural lands, even within the interior gubernias. This restriction effectively froze the capital of the Moscow Jewish elite, preventing the diversification of their assets and tethering their wealth to increasingly volatile urban commercial ventures. The implementation of the May laws also introduced the Review of Privileges, an administrative offensive that challenged the hereditary transmission of residency rights granted under the previous reign. The Ministry of Justice began to interpret the 1882 statutes as a mandate to narrow the definitions of qualified professionals, leading to the disqualification of thousands of individuals who had previously operated under artisan or merchant status. This legal retrenchment was supported by the Passport Department of the Moscow Police, which began to reject renewals for families who could not provide exhaustive, multi-generational proof of their professional standing. The 1882 mandate thus transformed the residency permit from a stable legal document into a conditional license subject to the evolving political reliability of the applicant. By the mid-1880s, the temporary regulations had created a state of legal paralysis as the ambiguity of the statutes allowed for contradictory interpretations by different branches of the bureaucracy. The Senate, acting as the High Court of Appeal, was inundated with petitions from Moscow residents seeking to contest the summary cancellation of their rights. However, the prevailing administrative zeal for national protectionism ensured that the majority of these appeals were rejected in favor of the local police's restrictive findings. The 1882 laws established a precedent for legislative erosion, where the slow, methodical removal of specific civic rights served as a precursor to total territorial displacement. The state's commitment to these regulations signaled that the integrationist period was not merely paused, but was being systematically dismantled through a series of provisional decrees that achieved the permanence of a state-sanctioned exclusionary code. The socio-economic justification for the restrictive measures of the late 19th century was reinforced by a pervasive populist movement that framed Jewish commercial presence as a structural threat to the Russian agrarian order. This intellectual shift was epitomized by the Gleb Uspensky sentiment, named after the prominent writer whose ethnographic studies of the Russian village categorized Jewish economic intermediaries as predatory agents of capitalist exploitation. This sentiment moved beyond traditional theological grievances, utilizing the language of ethno-economics to argue that the Russian peasant was fundamentally incompatible with the competitive, interest-driven market systems allegedly introduced by the Jewish minority. Within the Moscow intellectual circles, this narrative gained traction among the Slavophile and Narodnik factions, who viewed the city's thriving Zaryadye district not as a hub of urban productivity, but as a site of unproductive labor that drained the vitality of the Orthodox core. The statistical department of the Moscow provincial administration began to produce reports that corroborated this populist worldview, utilizing skewed economic data to suggest that Jewish artisans were displacing native Russian craftsmen through illegitimate price fixing and substandard production. These reports promoted the concept of the kulak Jew, a sociological archetype that merged the traditional fear of the rural usurer with the urban merchant, creating a singular narrative of exploitation that spanned both the Pale and the interior gubernias. This populist rhetoric was disseminated through influential periodicals such as Novoye Vremya, which argued that the economic self-defense of the Russian people necessitated the total removal of non-Orthodox commercial rivals from the metropolitan centers. Unlike previous eras where the state acted as the sole driver of exclusion, the 1880s saw the emergence of a broad social coalition that demanded the restoration of a people's economy based on protectionist, anti-mercantile principles. Furthermore, the Gleb Uspensky sentiment introduced the idea of moral economics, where the health of the state was measured by the purity of the transaction, rather than the accumulation of capital. Populist thinkers argued that Jewish trade networks operated through a clandestine solidarity that bypassed the traditional Russian ethical norms of the mir, village commune, and the artel, labor cooperative. This belief provided the Romanov administration with a powerful tool for social control, as it allowed the state to frame the coming expulsion as a restorative measure intended to protect the small man from the perceived excesses of urban capitalism. The Holy Synod amplified this sentiment by portraying the Orthodox artisan as a victim of materialist contamination, suggesting that the presence of non-Christian competitors undermined the spiritual value of manual labor. By 1888, this populist pressure had successfully influenced the Council of Ministers, leading to the introduction of laws that prioritized the awarding of government contracts exclusively to ethnically Russian entrepreneurs. The administrative language of the period increasingly utilized terms like korenizatsiya, nativization, to justify the systematic exclusion of Jewish professionals from the city's industrial sectors. This sociological offensive achieved a crucial objective. It delegitimized the useful categories of the 1860s by reframing their success as a sign of Russian national weakness. The Gleb Uspensky sentiment thus provided the emotional and intellectual weight necessary to transform the temporary laws into a permanent program of demographic purification. It ensured that the eventual mass displacement would be celebrated by the reactionary press as the liberation of the Moscow marketplace, confirming that In the final years of the century, populist xenophobia and imperial decree had become indistinguishable instruments of state policy. The administrative apparatus of Moscow during the late 1880s underwent a fundamental shift toward the professionalization of demographic surveillance, a process that replaced localized, informal arrangements with a centralized system of rigorous documentation. This transition was spearheaded by the Moscow Police Department, specifically under the Office of the Oberpolizeimeister, which sought to eliminate the administrative opacity that had previously allowed Jewish families to exist in the city through unofficial accommodations with local precinct captains. The cornerstone of this new oversight was the creation of the Secret Registry of Jewish Residents, a comprehensive card index system that categorized every non-Orthodox inhabitant, not by their legal status, but by their physical location and daily movement. This card, catalog, or kartoteka, functioned as a living database, enabling the central bureaucracy to monitor the specific expiration dates of residency permits without relying on the reports of subordinate officers who were susceptible to local influence or petty bribery. The primary engine of this surveillance was the mandated standardization of the domovye or house registers, which transformed the city's private property owners into involuntary agents of the state. Under new municipal ordinances, every house owner and apartment manager was held legally accountable for the precision of the registration logs, which required the immediate recording of any guest or tenant within 24 hours of their arrival. These registers were subjected to unannounced revizii, or audits, by specialized police inspectors who cross-referenced the names against the central secret registry. This multi-layered verification system effectively closed the gaps in urban oversight that had previously permitted illegal residents to find shelter in the dense residential blocks of the Zaryadye and Marina Roshcha districts. The professionalization of these records meant that the legal standing of a resident was no longer a matter of interpretation by a sympathetic neighbor, but a static data point in a centralized imperial ledger. Furthermore, the Moscow Okhrana, the secret political police, integrated these demographic records with their broader counter-subversion efforts, utilizing filery, undercover agents, to verify the professional activities of those registered as artisans. The surveillance apparatus was particularly focused on the masters' workshops, conducting frequent inspections to ensure that Jewish craftsmen were actively practicing the specific trade listed on their permits. Any discrepancy between the documented profession and the actual labor being performed resulted in the immediate entry of the individual into the unreliable list, a designation that served as a precursor to administrative removal. This level of granular oversight was facilitated by the introduction of identity verification certificates, which required photographs and physical descriptions, making it nearly impossible for individuals to utilize the passports of deceased or departed relatives. The centralization of this data moved the power of decision-making from the precinct to the Governor General's chancellery, creating a streamlined hierarchy of exclusion. By 1889, the Moscow police had successfully mapped the entire Jewish population with a degree of precision that was unprecedented in the Russian Empire. This bureaucratic mastery ensured that the state no longer operated on general estimates but on specific, verified intelligence. the professionalization of surveillance did not merely track the community, it effectively packaged it for eventual displacement by ensuring that every resident, their occupation, and their exact address were recorded in an accessible, actionable format. This administrative readiness transformed the community into a demographic mass that could be mechanically extracted from the urban fabric the moment the political command was issued, marking the final stage in the preparation for the comprehensive expulsion of 1891. The primary legal pathway for Jewish settlement in Moscow during the late 19th century rested upon the 1865 law on artisans, which granted remesleniki, or skilled craftsmen, the right of residence outside the pale of settlement. This statute was intended to address the shortage of technical labor in the Russian interior, but it quickly transformed into a strategic artisan loophole for thousands of families whose primary economic activities were often mercantile or intermediary. To secure legal standing, an individual was required to obtain a master's certificate from a recognized Czech or professional guild and maintain active registration with the Moscow Artisan Board. This bureaucratic requirement created a distinct class of nominal artisans, individuals who, while officially registered as tailors, hatters, or watchmakers, utilized their residency permits to engage in broader commercial ventures that bypassed the stricter capital requirements of the First Merchant Guild. The stability of this status was dependent on the Certificate of Mastery, a document that functioned as a surrogate for permanent citizenship. The Moscow Artisan Board, or Remeslenaya Uprava, served as the gatekeeper of this status, collecting communal dues and verifying that the applicant possessed the necessary equipment and workshop space to qualify as a practitioner. However, the legal definition of an active workshop remained notoriously ambiguous, allowing for a form of technical compliance where a minimal display of tools was sufficient to satisfy the periodic inspections of the municipal guilds. This system created a demographic layer of artisan merchants who occupied a gray zone between the specialized labor class and the deregulated market. By the late 1880s, these artisans represented the largest segment of the Jewish population in Moscow, forming the essential backbone of the city's middle market distribution networks and secondary manufacturing sectors. The state's offensive against this loophole began with a series of administrative circulars from the Ministry of the Interior, which sought to narrow the jurisdictional reach of the 1865 decree. The imperial bureaucracy argued that the right of residence was functionally contingent, meaning it was only valid as long as the artisan refrained from engaging in any trade outside their specific certified craft. Legal experts within the Chancellery promoted the theory of economic purity, asserting that the sale of manufactured goods not produced personally by the artisan constituted a violation of the residency contract. This interpretation allowed the police to conduct verification sweeps, where the discovery of finished products or a staff of more than 2 apprentices was used as legal grounds to strip a family of its residency rights. The goal was to transform the 1865 law from an integrationist tool into a restrictive trap where the complexity of modern industrial production was used to prove the illegality of the resident's labor. By 1891, the Romanov administration moved from individual disqualification to the total invalidation of the artisan category within the Moscow jurisdiction. The Ministry of Interior issued an executive interpretation stating that the 1865 law was never intended to grant a vested right, but was a conditional grant that the state could unilaterally terminate in the interest of public order. This shift in legal logic effectively nullified the standing of over 20,000 residents who had built their lives on the assumption of guild-protected residency. The Uprava records were seized by the Governor General's office, and the master's certificates were systematically marked for liquidatory deregistration. This finalized the state's plan to close the last remaining legal avenue for non-elite Jewish settlement, ensuring that the upcoming expulsion would target the community's largest and most economically integrated demographic. The artisan loophole was thus closed not through the courts, but through a radical administrative redefinition of what constituted useful labor in the eyes of the autocracy. The commercial landscape of Moscow in the late 19th century was defined by a concentrated economic friction within the Zaryadye district, an ancient mercantile quarter situated between the Kremlin and the wharves of the Moskva River. At the center of this friction was the Glebovskoye Podvorye, a state-sanctioned hostel and warehouse complex that served as the primary nexus for Jewish wholesale trade within the city. This specific geographic enclave allowed for the rapid development of a high-velocity credit market that challenged the traditional low-turnover business models of the Moscow merchant society. While the Russian merchantry, or kuptsi, relied on fixed assets and long-standing ancestral monopolies in the textile and leather sectors, the Jewish traders of the Zaryadye utilized a sophisticated network of vexelia, or bills of exchange, which linked the Moscow marketplaces directly to the industrial centers of Lodz and Warsaw. This structural divergence in capital management allowed Jewish intermediaries to offer significantly lower price points on manufactured goods, effectively dismantling the price controls established by the established city guilds. The Moscow Merchant Society, a powerful institutional body with direct access to the Ministry of Finance, viewed the success of the Zaryadye traders not as a benefit to the consumer, but as a form of commercial sabotage. In their formal petitions to the Governor General, the Russian guilds argued that the Jewish wholesale networks bypassed the traditional Gostiny Dvor systems, thereby avoiding the communal dues and sluzhba service obligations typically required of the city's merchant estate. The conflict was particularly acute in the haberdashery and dry goods sectors, where Jewish firms had successfully captured nearly 70% of the regional distribution. The Russian merchantry promoted the concept of fair competition as being contingent upon guild purity, suggesting that only those with deep-seated ties to the orthodox social order should hold the right to operate wholesale depots in the heart of the capital. This economic protectionism was reinforced by the 1888 municipal ordinance, which attempted to restrict the right of Jewish traders to lease stall space within the Kitai-Gorod walls, a move intended to physically isolate the Jewish commercial hub from the city's primary retail corridors. Furthermore, the rivalry was intensified by differing approaches to international procurement. Jewish houses in Moscow frequently operated as agents for foreign textile manufacturers, facilitating the influx of high-quality European fabrics that outperformed the domestic Russian mills owned by the Moscow elite. The Moskovskoye Kupicheskoye Obshtestvo lobbied for the implementation of localized transit tariffs and stricter customs inspections, specifically targeting goods consigned to Zaryadye warehouses. They utilized their influence within the Ministry of Interior to frame Jewish mercantile success as a monetary flight, claiming that the profits from Moscow trade were being drained from the Russian treasury into foreign bank accounts. This narrative converted a market-based rivalry into a matter of national fiscal integrity, providing the state with a pragmatic rationale to intervene in the private sector. By 1890, the economic friction had reached a terminal phase, as the Russian merchant guilds formally requested the deregistration of non-orthodox competitors as a restorative measure for the city's commercial health. The Governor General's office began to utilize guild audits to identify Jewish firms that had utilized temporary partnerships with Christian fronts to secure first guild standing. These investigations were not aimed at fiscal regulation, but at the systematic removal of the competitive infrastructure that had allowed the Zaryadye to thrive. The economic rivalry thus provided the political momentum for the 1891 expulsion, as the state identified the removal of the Jewish merchant class as the most efficient method to stabilize the traditional Russian mercantile order. The Zaryadye, once the most vibrant commercial node in the city, was increasingly portrayed in state reports as a foreign colony that had to be liquidated to ensure the economic sovereignty of the Holy Capital. The appointment of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich as the Governor General of Moscow on February 26, 1891, signaled a definitive transition from the era of regional accommodation to one of centralized military-style discipline. For 25 years, the city had been administered by Prince Vladimir Dolgorukov, whose tenure was characterized by a pragmatic, old Moscow liberalism that prioritized commercial stability over the rigid enforcement of exclusionary statutes. Sergei Alexandrovich, the brother of Emperor Alexander III, entered the capital not as a traditional civic administrator, but as a soldier bureaucrat whose primary mandate was the total realignment of the city's governance with the reactionary ethos of the Gatchina court. His arrival in May 1891 followed a period of intense lobbying by the ultra-conservative factions of the Romanov family, who viewed Dolgorukov's tolerance of the Zaryadye commercial networks as a dereliction of imperial duty. The change in leadership was designed to provide the executive will necessary to execute policies that the previous administration had deemed economically hazardous or logistically impossible. The Grand Duke's administrative philosophy was rooted in a strict interpretation of Preobrazhenskaya discipline, whereby the city of Moscow was viewed as a strategic fortress of Russianism rather than a cosmopolitan trading hub. Upon assuming office, Sergei Alexandrovich immediately initiated a comprehensive overhaul of the Governor-General's Chancellery, replacing the seasoned civil servants of the previous reign with military aides and ultra-nationalist ideologues. This restructuring was intended to bypass the traditional municipal boards and city councils, which often favored mercantile interests, and to establish a direct, unmediated link between the Moscow police apparatus and the imperial family. The Grand Duke's personal involvement in the oversight of the secret chancellery ensured that demographic policy was no longer a matter of civic debate, but was treated as a military operation. This administrative rigidity was reflected in his first series of circular orders, which commanded all provincial voivodes to prioritize the homogenization of the urban fabric over the preservation of existing commercial contracts. Sergei Alexandrovich served as the essential bridge between the theoretical anti-Semitism of the Holy Synod and the kinetic force of the Moscow police. His proximity to Alexander III allowed him to secure absolute sovereign support for a program of administrative purification, a term utilized in his private correspondence to describe the systematic removal of non-Orthodox populations from the imperial heartland. Unlike Dolgorukov, who had utilized informal exceptions to maintain economic liquidity, the Grand Duke viewed any deviation from the letter of the law as a form of moral and political corruption. His appointment coincided with the finalization of the March 28 decree, providing the Romanov state with an enforcer whose personal commitment to religious uniformity outweighed any concern for the city's fiscal stability. The Grand Duke's presence in Moscow acted as a deterrent to any lingering reformist sentiments within the municipal bureaucracy, as he effectively criminalized the pragmatic leniency that had characterized the preceding decades. By mid-1891, the entry of Sergei Alexandrovich had fundamentally altered the psychology of the Moscow administration. The Governor General's office shifted its operational focus from the regulation of urban life to the preparation for a mass demographic extraction. This era was defined by the replacement of the social contract with the executive command, a shift that rendered the existing rights of the Jewish community legally and practically null. The Grand Duke's arrival marked the end of Moscow's status as a distinct jurisdictional space, incorporating it into the broader reactionary program of the autocracy. Consequently, the appointment was not merely a change in personnel, but the activation of a state-sanctioned machine of displacement, ensuring that the upcoming expulsion would be executed with the mechanical precision of a military campaign. The ideological core of the 1891 administrative shift was the mission of purification, a programmatic effort by the Moscow Governor General's office to restore the city's traditional soslovie, estate hierarchies. This mission operated on the belief that the urban center of Moscow was a sacred space that required a demographic physiognomy consistent with the mythic traditions of the pre-Petrine era. Central to this objective was the Grand Duke's vow to cleanse the Kremlin's shadow of what he categorized as chuzhi, alien elements whose socio-economic structures were perceived as a corrosive influence on the Orthodox social order. This was not merely a police initiative, but a project of juridical sacralization, where the physical removal of the Jewish population was framed as a necessary prerequisite for the moral and spiritual restoration of the ancient capital. The administration sought to reverse the social blurring that had occurred during the preceding decades, aiming to re-establish a rigid stratification where the merchant, artisan, and gentry estates were defined by their ethnic and religious homogeneity. Under this purification mandate, the Moscow administration began to treat urban planning as an instrument of ecclesiastical policy. The Governor General's Chancellery issued internal circulars that defined the presence of non-baptized subjects as a form of visual and social pollution that obstructed the city's role as the heart of orthodoxy. This rhetoric moved beyond the economic arguments of the merchant guilds, focusing instead on the symbolic integrity of Moscow as the Third Rome. The Grand Duke argued that the empire's internal strength was contingent upon the demographic clarity of its central nodes, suggesting that the diverse population of the Tsariyadye was a structural anomaly that weakened the autocratic bond. To achieve this, the state utilized administrative exorcism, the systematic extraction of specific groups to ensure that the city's social fabric reflected the theological ideals of the Romanov dynasty. This policy targeted the Russification of the streets, where the removal of Jewish signs, businesses, and communal structures was viewed as a restorative act of national reclamation. Furthermore, the mission of purification sought to dismantle the hybrid identities that had emerged among the Russified Jewish intelligentsia. The Grand Duke's administration viewed the integrated, university-educated Jew as more dangerous than the traditional resident of the Pale, as they occupied professional spaces that were traditionally reserved for the Orthodox gentry. The restoration of hierarchies required that the professional classes in Moscow be reclaimed by Korenya Rossiyanin, indigenous Russians, thereby ensuring that the city's intellectual and economic leadership remained a closed, confessional circle. This drive for social purity was supported by the Ministry of the Imperial Court, which provided the financial and political backing for the Grand Duke to bypass the legal complexities of the civil code. The administration's focus was on the total alignment of the city's residents with the state's theological mission, a goal that rendered the previous concepts of economic utility entirely irrelevant. By the spring of 1891, the mission of purification had become the guiding principle for every municipal department in Moscow. The state's rhetoric increasingly equated cleansing with security, suggesting that the physical departure of the Jewish community was the only way to safeguard the city from the perceived decay of modern pluralism. This ideological project established a binary social map where the city was divided into those who belonged to the national body and those who were destined for geographic erasure. The Grand Duke's vow thus transformed the 1891 expulsion into a holy crusade of the bureaucracy, ensuring that the mass displacement was executed as a formal act of state-sanctioned purification. The mission achieved its ultimate objective by redefining Moscow not as a commercial crossroads, but as a demarcated zone of orthodox exclusivity, effectively closing the ancient capital to any subject who stood outside the traditional socio-ecclesiastical order of the Romanov state. On March 28, 1891, the bureaucratic mechanisms of the Russian Empire reached a terminal point with the finalized drafting of the imperial ukaz concerning the Jewish residents of Moscow. This document, prepared under the immediate supervision of Ivan Durnovo, the Minister of the Interior, was the culmination of a confidential interdepartmental collaboration designed to bypass the traditional legislative delays of the State Council. The decree was processed as a high-priority state order, a classification that allowed the ministry to circumvent public debate and implement the measure through direct executive mandate. The decision to maintain the decree's secrecy during the drafting phase was a calculated fiscal strategy intended to neutralize the threat of capital flight, as the imperial administration feared that an early disclosure would prompt a sudden liquidation of Jewish-owned assets and the subsequent transfer of hard currency to foreign banking centers. By treating the order as a state secret, the Romanov bureaucracy aimed to ensure that the community's productive wealth remained within the Russian tax jurisdiction until the moment of physical extraction. The technical language of the March 28th decree was meticulously structured to categorize the expulsion as a regulatory adjustment rather than a punitive measure, thereby avoiding the necessity of a formal judicial review by the Senate. Durnovo's chancellery worked in conjunction with the Ministry of Finance, then led by Ivan Vishnegradsky, to assess the potential impact on the Moscow textile markets and to coordinate the eventual seizure of abandoned properties. The decree specifically identified the categories of artisans, brewers, and distillers as the primary targets for removal, effectively invalidating the residency permits of over two-thirds of the city's Jewish population with a single administrative stroke. This document served as the definitive legal bridge between the ideological mandates of the Governor-General and the kinetic power of the Moscow police, providing a standardized framework for the systematic displacement that was to follow. The imperial signature of Alexander III on the document finalized the shift from theoretical restrictive policy to irreversible executive action, marking the first time in the 19th century that a mass expulsion was authorized for an entire social class within the Russian interior. The secret designation of the March 28th order also facilitated a coordinated delay in its dissemination to the provincial governors, ensuring that the local administrations within the Pale of Settlement remained unprepared for the sudden influx of refugees. This lack of communication was a deliberate tactic to prioritize the transition of the Moscow market over the social stability of the western borderlands. The Ministry of Interior utilized the secret chancellery to verify that no leak of information occurred within the Moscow municipal boards, as any early movement of goods from the wholesale warehouses would have undermined the state's objective of a controlled liquidation. The drafting process thus reflected a synthesis of police-state surveillance and mercantilist protectionism, where the preservation of the imperial treasury's liquidity was valued above the civil rights of the subjects. The March 28th decree established a precedent for decree-based governance where the traditional legal protections of the Russian Code were suspended in favor of high-priority executive orders. By the time the document was transmitted to the Governor-General's office, the state had successfully constructed a legal trap that allowed for the total removal of the community, while ensuring the maximum retention of their material assets within the Orthodox economy. The transition of the March 28th decree from a classified state document to a public mandate was executed with a precision that utilized the Jewish religious calendar as a tool of administrative leverage. On the morning of March 29, 1891, which coincided with the first day of Passover, the official government gazette, Moskovsky Vedomosti, published the imperial order for the categorical removal of Jewish artisans and their families. This timing was not a logistical coincidence, but a deliberate theological alignment orchestrated by the Governor-General's chancellery to amplify the psychological impact of the state's authority. By choosing the festival that commemorates the biblical Exodus and liberation, the Romanov administration engaged in a form of symbolic inversion, whereby the state utilized the community's own historical narrative of displacement to signal the finality of their presence in the Russian heartland. The public proclamation transformed the private domesticity of the holiday into a site of state-sanctioned trauma, effectively disrupting the communal solidarity required for a structured response. The mechanism of the proclamation involved the simultaneous posting of the prikaz, or police order, in every precinct station and municipal square across Moscow. Under the direction of the Oberpolizeimeister Pavel Vlasovsky, the city's law enforcement utilized the holiday's requirement for family gatherings to ensure that the maximum number of residents were present to receive their individual Vasilka, expulsion, notices. This strategy solved the administrative problem of serving papers to a mobile urban population, as the police were aware that the religious strictures of Passover restricted travel and commercial movement. The proclamation was characterized in the reactionary press as a paschal gift to the Russian people, a rhetorical device that framed the expulsion as a festive reclamation of the Orthodox capital. This framing aimed to align the municipal action with the liturgical cycle of the state church, suggesting that the cleaning of Moscow was a spiritual necessity for the upcoming Christian Easter. The social response to the Passover proclamation was one of immediate and profound administrative paralysis. Because the decree invalidated the right of residence for the largest categories of the population with immediate effect, the community's leadership at the Moscow Choral Synagogue was unable to organize legal appeals before the first wave of police registrations began. The proclamation phase introduced the mandatory census update, where every household served with a notice was required to report to their local uchastok precinct within 48 hours to declare their intended departure date. This bureaucratic offensive utilized the shock of the announcement to prevent the formation of residency defense committees, as the state prioritized the rapid atomization of the community. The 1891 proclamation established a precedent for psychological policing, where the calendar of the target group was weaponized to facilitate the speed of their removal. Furthermore, the timing of the announcement allowed the Ministry of Interior to monitor the immediate movement of liquid capital. The Passover proclamation triggered a localized run on the private banks in the Zaryadye, which the secret chancellery utilized to identify the wealthiest families for prioritized processing. By synchronizing the decree with the period of high communal activity, the state ensured that the invisible community was made visible for the purpose of census verification. This phase of the 1891 event marked the collapse of the social contract of exception, replacing it with a theocratic mandate that recognized no secular professional standing. The proclamation did not merely inform the residents of their departure, it redefined the city of Moscow as a space where the Jewish faith was officially categorized as incompatible with the municipal order. Consequently, the April 1891 announcement served as the kinetic trigger for the mass displacement, turning the ancient capital into a zone of high-velocity administrative extraction. The legal finality of the 1891 expulsion was anchored in the categorical phrasing of the imperial decree, a document that utilized precise administrative semantics to eliminate any ambiguity regarding residency rights. The text of the ukaz did not employ the emotive term izgnany, expulsion, but rather the bureaucratic Vosprzeczenie dostośnego żitelstwa, the prohibition of continued residence. This lexical choice was a strategic maneuver by the Ministry of Justice to frame the mass removal as a corrective enforcement of pre-existing, though previously ignored, territorial boundaries. By defining the Jewish presence in Moscow as a prolonged administrative error, the decree's language effectively nullified the concept of vested rights or prescriptive tenure. The phrasing established a universal prohibitive norm whereby the state recognized no distinction between a resident of 30 years and a transient laborer, as both were subsumed under the singular category of those lacking the fundamental right of inhabitancy. A primary feature of the decree's categorical language was the explicit definition of semya, or the family unit, which was phrased to ensure a comprehensive demographic extraction. The ukaz stipulated that the prohibition applied not only to the head of the household, but bez isključenia, without exception, to all wives, children, and dependent relatives. This phrasing was designed to prevent the fragmentation of residency, a tactic previously used by families to maintain a foothold in the city through an individual whose permit remained valid. The legal text mandated the simultaneous liquidation of hearth and home, a directive that forced the collective removal of entire genealogical lines. Furthermore, the decree utilized the term nemedleno prekrashchenie, or immediate cessation, of all professional activities, which served to decouple the residents' economic function from their legal standing the moment the notice was served. The document also introduced a phased chronology of departure, which categorized the targeted population into 3 distinct temporal tiers based on their duration of residence. Those who had inhabited Moscow for less than 3 years were granted a 3-month window. Those with 3 to 6 years were given 6 months, and long-term residents were allowed a maximum of 9 months to settle their affairs. This chronometric mandate was phrased as a final act of imperial leniency, a rhetorical device that allowed the state to reject any subsequent petitions for extensions. The decree explicitly barred the use of osobia obstoyatelstva, or special circumstances, such as illness or advanced age, as valid grounds for an administrative stay of execution. By establishing these rigid timeframes in the text itself, the Romanov bureaucracy eliminated the discretionary power of local magistrates, ensuring that the pace of the expulsion was dictated by the calendar rather than the court. The categorical nature of the ukaz was finalized by the clause revoking the 1865 statute specifically within the Moscow municipal jurisdiction. The phrasing was ostavit bez действия, to leave without effect, the very laws that had permitted the community's growth. This linguistic excision transformed thousands of legally registered subjects into vni zakony, extra-legal entities overnight. The decree's language was characterized by juridical exclusivity, meaning it provided no mechanism for re-registration or the upgrading of status to the First Merchant Guild once the expulsion process had commenced. This finalized the state's transition to a policy of total territorial denial, where the language of the law was used to create a definitive geographic barrier between the Jewish population and the imperial interior. The 1891 decree thus functioned as a linguistic instrument of erasure, where the categorical phrasing ensured that the separation from Moscow was absolute, documented, and legally irreversible. The execution of the 1891 mandate transitioned from a legislative decree to a logistical operation through the implementation of a phased evacuation, an administrative system designed to manage the simultaneous extraction of 20,000 individuals without collapsing the city's transport infrastructure. This operation was governed by the Evacuation Committee, a specialized body within the Governor General's Chancellery tasked with sorting the Jewish population into 3 chronological tiers based on their documented duration of residence and family status. The 3-month window was applied primarily to Neobremenia Semyami, unmarried individuals or those who had resided in Moscow for less than 3 years, requiring their departure by midsummer 1891. The second tier, granted 6 months, encompassed established artisans with small workshops, while the 9-month extension was reserved for First Guild merchants and property owners whose financial entanglements necessitated a longer liquidation period. This staggered timeline was not a humanitarian concession, but a strategic measure to prevent a sudden, massive surge of refugees that would have overwhelmed the railway stations and the police checkpoints at the city's periphery. The primary administrative instrument for enforcing this timeline was the Otkriti list, or open sheet, which replaced the internal passport for every individual marked for removal. Upon registration at the local precinct, the resident was forced to surrender their permanent identity papers in exchange for this temporary transit document, which listed the specific, non-negotiable date by which they were required to cross the municipal boundary. The Otkriti list functioned as a mobile warrant, granting the police the authority to conduct summary arrests of anyone found within Moscow after their assigned date had passed. This system achieved a total bureaucratic denaturalization, as it stripped the resident of their standing as a subject and redefined them as a transit object under the direct custody of the Ministry of the Interior. The Evacuation Committee utilized these lists to maintain a daily departure quota, ensuring that the volume of the exodus remained within the operational limits of the Moscow-Brest and Moscow-Kiev railway lines. The financial pressure of the 3-stage timeline acted as an economic compression mechanism, whereby the artificial scarcity of time was used to accelerate the transfer of assets to the Orthodox majority. Because the state prohibited the carryover of residency rights into the following fiscal year, residents were forced into a panic liquidation of their commercial inventories and household effects. The inventory phase required every departing family to submit a detailed list of their movable property to the local Pristav, police commissioner, who then monitored the progress of its sale. As the deadlines approached, the market was flooded with specialized tools, textile stocks, and residential furniture, causing a precipitous drop in valuations that state auditors recorded as a market correction. The timeline effectively ensured that the exiting population could not leverage their assets to secure a future in the Pale, as the majority of their liquid wealth was consumed by the costs of the forced auctions and the inflated transport fees. Furthermore, the phased chronology served to atomize the community by separating families according to their individual professional standing. While a master artisan might be granted 6 months, His unregistered apprentices or adult children often fell into the 3-month category, forcing a fragmented departure that dismantled the communal support networks of the Zaryadye. The Moscow Municipal Administration utilized the Vremenaya Komissiya, temporary commission, to verify that no individual utilized a relative's longer window to remain in the city illegally. This logistical rigor ensured that by the end of each stage, the targeted districts were systematically cleared of their specific demographic tiers. The 1891 timeline thus represented the perfection of chronometric policing, where the calendar was used to achieve a level of demographic control that the general laws of the empire had previously failed to provide. The staggered exit concluded the transition of Moscow from a site of resident labor to a managed pipeline of state-directed displacement. The physical enforcement of the 1891 expulsion was characterized by the Oblava system, a series of coordinated midnight raids designed to identify and extract residents whose presence was no longer authorized under the March 28 mandate. This tactical phase was facilitated by Moscow's legal status under Usilenaya Okhrana, or reinforced protection, a state of emergency that granted the police the authority to conduct nocturnal searches of private residences without the traditional judicial warrants required by the 1864 Code of Criminal Procedure. Under the command of the Moscow Oberpolizeimeister, these operations were conducted with military synchronization, typically commencing between the hours of midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. To maximize the available manpower, the municipal administration utilized the Pozharnaya Komanda, or the City Fire Brigade, to augment the regular Gorodovye, policemen, and Uchastkovye, precinct officers, effectively surrounding entire residential blocks in the Zaryadye and Mariina Roshcha districts before the start of the inspection. The procedural execution of these raids involved the Nochnye osmetry, or nightly inspections, where police units moved floor to floor through tenement buildings to verify the physical occupancy of every room against the documented names in the house registers. Inspectors were issued specific, tactical instructions that commanded the thorough searching of non-traditional living spaces, including closets, attics, and storage vats, to uncover individuals attempting to evade the census. Any individual discovered on the premises whose name was not explicitly recorded in the Domovye Knigi, or whose residency window had expired according to the Odkrity list, was subject to immediate administrative detention. This logistical rigor was intended to solve the problem of clandestine shelter, where families attempted to hide relatives from the Pale or apprentices whose permits had been invalidated. The 1891 raids transformed the private home into a site of high-velocity administrative processing, where the burden of proof regarding legal status was placed entirely upon the resident during the moment of inspection. A critical component of the midnight raids was the system of immediate penalization for property owners found to be harboring unregistered guests. Landlords were subject to heavy municipal fines or the loss of their own business licenses if a raid revealed illegal occupants, a policy that incentivized the Russian householders to act as auxiliary informants for the state. Those apprehended during these nocturnal sweeps were transported to the Sushchovsky or Myasnitsky police houses, which functioned as temporary filtration centers. In these facilities, the secret chancellery conducted rapid audits of the detainees' passports. Those found in violation of the 1891 decree were not returned to their homes but were held in custody until they could be escorted to the railway terminals for deportation under guard. This conveyor belt of arrest and transit ensured that the city was cleared of its surplus population with a speed that bypassed the capacity of the local court system. The Oblava system also targeted the transient merchantry, individuals who utilized temporary business trips to Moscow to maintain their commercial networks. The police conducted unannounced raids on commercial inns and third-class hotels, utilizing the guest registry to identify any Jewish visitor whose stay exceeded the 24-hour limit. This level of granular enforcement ensured that the city remained a closed jurisdiction, even for those not directly targeted by the primary expulsion stages. By the autumn of 1891, the midnight raids had become a standardized municipal ritual, serving as a visceral deterrent against any attempt to resist the imperial timeline. The use of the fire brigade and the state of emergency status demonstrated that the Romanov administration viewed the expulsion not as a civil matter, but as a security operation requiring the total mobilization of the city's paramilitary resources. Consequently, the raids achieved the final cleansing of the urban interior, ensuring that the legal prohibition of Jewish residency was enforced through the physical mastery of the city's nocturnal landscape. The financial reality of the 1891 mandate manifested as a localized depression of the Moscow property market, specifically concentrated within the Zaryadye district. This area, which functioned as the primary repository for millions of rubles in commercial inventory and movable capital, faced a systematic devaluation triggered by the hypersupply of assets during the 3-month liquidation window. The liquidation of the Zaryadye was not a decentralized market event, but a state-monitored divestment where the forced disposal of leaseholds, warehouses, and retail lavki occurred under conditions of extreme economic duress. Because the imperial decree prohibited the retention of business ownership by those marked for removal, the community's accumulated goodwill, and established trade routes were effectively reduced to zero in the municipal ledgers. This created a profound valuation deficit, where the productive assets of the Jewish merchantry were sold at prices that typically hovered between 30 and 50% of their pre-decree market values. The centerpiece of this financial erosion was the Glebovskoye Podvorye, the massive state-owned hostel and trading complex that anchored the district's commercial life. Following the Passover proclamation, the liquidatory commissions established by the Moscow Governor-General's Chancellery oversaw the mandatory auctioning of thousands of individual leasehold contracts within the Podvory. These auctions attracted a specific demographic of Christian speculators and provincial buyers who utilized the time constraint of the expulsion tiers to drive down bid amounts. For many residents, the cost of liquidatory storage, the fee charged by the city to house unsold goods after the departure deadline, exceeded the potential recovery from a future sale, incentivizing immediate and ruinous divestment. Historical ledger data from the Moscow Treasury indicates that the turnover of inventory during the summer of 1891 reached unprecedented volumes, yet the resulting capital gains accrued almost exclusively to the incoming Russian entrepreneurs. The administrative management of these sales was handled by the Opiekuński Sovet, or Guardianship Council, which was tasked with resolving the sudebne iski, legal claims, of Christian creditors against departing Jewish firms. The state prioritized the settlement of debts over the protection of the seller's equity, frequently authorizing the summary seizure of commercial stocks to satisfy minor financial obligations. This policy ensured that the exiting population reached the railway terminals in a state of fiscal nakedness, having converted their entire physical existence into a minimal amount of portable copper currency. The liquidation also encompassed vinaya arrenda, liquor leases, and industrial provisioning contracts, where the equipment and specialized machinery of the Zariadye workshops were purchased for the value of their raw materials. This wealth transfer was documented by the Moscow Merchant Society as a nationalization of opportunity, whereby the infrastructure built by the Jewish community was absorbed into the Orthodox guild system without the necessity of competitive compensation. By late 1891, the immediate aftermath of the liquidation was visible in the hollowed-out landscape of the Zariadye. The district's trading rows, which had previously operated as a high-velocity credit hub, were replaced by a series of state-owned warehouses and stalls that remained vacant as the new owners struggled to replicate the complex cross-border logistics of their predecessors. The liquidatory deficit resulted in a localized credit freeze, as the promissory notes previously issued by Zariadye houses were declared null and void by the provincial courts. The state successfully achieved the total removal of the community's economic footprint, but at the cost of a systemic commercial contraction that saw Moscow's secondary trade volume drop by nearly 40% in a single fiscal year. The Zariadye had been transformed from a vibrant mercantile node into a static administrative buffer, completing the work of the 1891 decree through the total destruction of the community's material foundations. The distressed sales of 1891 represented the practical mechanism through which the Moscow merchantry achieved a state-sanctioned monopoly over the city's internal distribution networks. As the tiered departure deadlines approached, the Jewish commercial elite was forced to engage in compulsory divestment, a process where the technical ownership of wholesale inventories was transferred to Orthodox buyers at rates determined by the urgency of the exodus. These transactions were managed through liquidation centers established in the Kitay-Gorod and Ilyinka districts, where municipal observers verified that all sales were concluded before the residents' Otkriti list reached its terminal date. This period was marked by the emergence of speculative syndicates, groups of Russian entrepreneurs who pooled capital to purchase entire warehouses of high-demand commodities, such as Belgian lace, German hardware, and Polish linens, for a fraction of their landed cost. The state facilitated this inventory shift by suspending traditional merchant duties for the purchasers, effectively subsidizing the expansion of Orthodox firms at the expense of the departing residents. The market of duress was particularly visible in the artisanal workshops, where specialized machinery and raw materials were sold under the supervision of the pristav. Because the state prohibited the transport of industrial equipment to the Pale, master craftsmen were forced to sell their sredstva proizvodstva, means of production, to local rivals who frequently refused to offer more than the scrap valuation for highly calibrated tools. This led to a technical extraction, whereby the sophisticated manufacturing capabilities developed by the Moscow Jewish community were absorbed into the Russian guild system without a corresponding exchange of fair market value. The Moscow City Duma recorded these acquisitions as domestic reclamations, framing the loss of Jewish capital as a necessary realignment for the sovereignty of the national market. The distressed nature of these sales ensured that the departing population could not regenerate their commercial influence in the borderland provinces, as their operational capital was effectively trapped within the Moscow fiscal jurisdiction through these undervalued transactions. Furthermore, the distressed sales targeted the professional libraries and apothecary stocks of the Jewish intelligentsia, where rare scientific texts and chemical precursors were liquidated in bulk. These sales were often conducted at stoyanki, transit stations, where the police monitored the volume of baggage to ensure that only strictly personal items were taken. The resulting asset vacuum allowed for the rapid ascent of a new tier of Russian predprinimatelli, entrepreneurs who had previously been unable to compete with the established credit networks of the Zariadye. This redistribution of retail and wholesale space was finalized by the leasehold reassignment program, where the city administration granted the newly vacant stall spaces to members of the Orthodox Merchant Society at preferential rates. By the winter of 1891, the distressed sales had achieved the total conversion of the Moscow marketplace into a confessional monopoly, ensuring that the economic infrastructure of the city was purged of its previous competitive diversity. The state's role in these transactions was not merely regulatory, but participatory, as the Ministry of Finance utilized the valuation drop to stabilize the prices of consumer goods for the remaining population. The administrative machinery ensured that no Jewish firm could survive the transition through silent partnerships with Russian proxies, as the Governor General's office mandated a full disclosure of beneficial ownership for every new commercial license issued. This finalized the mercantile purification of the city, whereby the material remains of the Jewish presence were used to subsidize the growth of the traditional Russian merchant estate. Consequently, the 1891 expulsion was finalized through a massive, non-compensated transfer of movable wealth, marking the terminal point of the Jewish commercial legacy in the heart of the Russian Empire. The execution phase of the 1891 expulsion was defined by the emergence of a decentralized economy of extortion, where the discretionary power of the district ispravnik and the precinct pristav superseded the standardized protocols of the imperial chancellery. While the March 28th mandate established a rigid legal framework, the physical enforcement of departure dates provided local police commanders with a lucrative opportunity for administrative arbitrage. This phenomenon, categorized in contemporary internal audits as proizvol or official arbitrariness, transformed the residency permit into a negotiable instrument. Police officials utilized the departure tier system to demand informal fees, known as vzyatka, in exchange for a postponement of removal. These unofficial extensions were frequently granted to individuals who could provide liquid capital to the local chancery, creating a shadow bureaucracy where the actual date of an exodus was determined by the resident's ability to satisfy the financial demands of the precinct station rather than the requirements of the law. The corruption within the Moscow police apparatus was particularly acute during the verification of family registers. Officers frequently threatened to classify adult children or elderly relatives as unregistered transients, a designation that carried the penalty of immediate imprisonment in the Sushchovsky detention house. To avoid the fragmentation of the family unit, residents were forced to pay protection gratuities to the investigating officers, a practice that functioned as a secondary tax on the departing community. This systemic extraction was facilitated by the Certificate of Compliance, a document issued by the local uchastok that verified a resident had finalized their affairs. Without this signed clearance, a family could not legally board the railway transports, granting the issuing officer ultimate leverage over the timing of the departure. Historical complaints submitted to the Ministry of Justice, though largely ignored by the Governor General's office, detailed instances where police commanders demanded percentages of the proceeds from the sale of household effects as a condition for signing the final transit papers. Furthermore, the professionalization of surveillance, which had been intended to streamline the expulsion, became a tool for targeted extortion. The secret registry was utilized by corrupt officials to identify high-value targets, wealthy families whose documentation contained minor clerical discrepancies. These families were subjected to administrative harassment, characterized by frequent, unrecorded inspections of their internal passports at irregular hours. The goal was to incentivize the payment of leniency fees, which ensured that the family remained at the bottom of the weekly deportation lists. This corruption extended to the railway platforms, where the station gendarmes frequently demanded additional payments for the right to transport baggage that had already been officially appraised and cleared. The Romanov administration's reliance on the police to execute a high-velocity extraction created a climate of impunity, as the central government prioritized the speed of the cleansing over the ethical conduct of its enforcers. The financial impact of this systemic corruption resulted in a significant diversion of capital from the imperial treasury into the private accounts of the Moscow police elite. While the state's protectionist policies aimed to transfer wealth to the Orthodox merchantry, the Ispravnik economy siphoned off a substantial portion of the community's remaining liquid reserves. This created a profound disconnect between the ideological goals of the Grand Duke and the pragmatic greed of the municipal officers. The corruption of the 1891 event was not merely a byproduct of administrative failure, but an integral component of the exclusionary process, as it provided the coercive force necessary to maintain the momentum of the displacement. By the winter of 1891, the abuse of discretionary power had achieved a state of permanence, ensuring that the final months of Jewish residency in Moscow were marked by a total collapse of legal predictability in favor of a state-sanctioned system of predatory extraction. This chapter of the expulsion concludes the transition of the Moscow police from a regulatory body into a paramilitary engine of fiscal exploitation, finalizing the material ruin of the community before they reached the borders of the Pale. The finality of the 1891 administrative process was achieved through the revocation of identity, a systematic campaign to erase the legal existence of the Jewish community within the official records of the Moscow municipal state. This phase was managed by the Passportny Stol, or passport desk, of the Moscow Police Administration, which served as the central clearinghouse for the pogasheny, the physical extinguishing or cancellation of residency stamps. Unlike the earlier stages of the expulsion, which focused on the physical movement of people, this bureaucratic offensive targeted the legal persona of the subject, ensuring that once an individual was marked for removal, their status as a registered inhabitant was permanently struck from the imperial archives. The physical act of cancellation involved the application of a red stamp of invalidation across the existing residency permit in the internal passport, a marking that immediately rendered the document useless for any civic or commercial transaction within the Russian interior. The mechanism of juridical deregistration extended to the mesto pripiski, the mandatory place of registration that anchored every subject to a specific administrative district. By revoking the Moscow registration without immediately assigning a new permanent locale, the state effectively created a condition of legal nullity. This status meant that the individual could no longer exercise basic civil rights, such as the notarization of deeds, the filing of judicial petitions, or the authentication of signatures for banking purposes. The passport desk operated with a directive to treat the departing residents as persons under deportation order, a category that stripped them of the protections typically afforded to the merchant or artisan estates. This systematic erasure ensured that the community was not merely moving from one city to another, but was being unmade as a constituent part of the Moscow social fabric. The state's objective was the total cadastral erasure of the community, where the removal of a name from the tax rolls and census lists served as the definitive proof of the land's cleansing. Furthermore, the Moscow Municipal Administration utilized the Vedomosti, official gazettes, to publish lists of canceled residency permits, alerting the city's financial institutions that the individuals named no longer held standing to maintain active accounts. This public invalidation was a critical component of the state's effort to sever the community's remaining institutional ties. The Passportny Stol also introduced a permanent prohibitive annotation in the passports of the expelled, which barred them from re-entering the Moscow governorate for a period of 20 years. This annotation, known colloquially as the black mark, transformed the internal passport into a permanent record of exclusion, ensuring that the revocation of identity followed the individual into the Pale of Settlement. The administrative machinery thus achieved a level of documentary finality that made the 1891 event irreversible, as the legal framework that had permitted their presence was physically destroyed within the paper records of the state. The revocation of identity concluded with the seizure and archiving of communal records from the Moscow Choral Synagogue and the Jewish burial societies. By taking custody of these metrical books, the state gained total control over the genealogical data of the community, preventing future claims of residency based on birth or long-term habitation. This institutional decapitation removed the community's ability to verify its own history, making them entirely dependent on the state's restrictive ledgers. The 1891 event thus reached its zenith not through physical force, but through the violence of the pen, where the systematic cancellation of stamps and the deletion of names from municipal registers finalized the community's transition from integrated residents to legal non-entities. Consequently, the revocation of identity ensured that the departure from Moscow was a totalizing experience of civic death, leaving behind a city whose official records showed no trace of the 20,000 residents who had shaped its mercantile vitality for decades. The academic dimensions of the 1891 displacement were codified through a series of restrictive circulars issued by the Ministry of Public Education, which sought to dismantle the intellectual infrastructure of the Jewish community in the ancient capital. This academic exile was the operational realization of the Procentnaya Norma, or percentage quota system, which had been formally introduced by Education Minister Ivan Delyanov in 1887, but reached its terminal phase in Moscow during the governorship of Sergei Alexandrovich. The ministry's objective was the systematic reduction of the Jewish presence within the Imperial Moscow University and the Moscow Technical School to a maximum of 3%, a threshold designed to prevent the formation of a non-Orthodox professional class. Unlike the previous era, where education served as a catalyst for legal integration, the 1891 policy treated the Jewish student body as an ideological threat to the autocratic unanimity of the imperial student estate. The administrative mechanism for this purge involved the summary dismissal of Jewish volnosluchateli, or auditing students, who had previously occupied a significant portion of the medical and legal faculties. Following the April proclamation, the university administration was commanded to conduct a pedagogical audit, whereby the enrollment records of every Jewish student were scrutinized for even the slightest clerical discrepancy in their residency documents. For many, the revocation of their artisan or merchant class residency status, as detailed in previous chapters, resulted in the immediate and automatic cancellation of their university registration. This created a condition of double exclusion, where the loss of a city permit legally invalidated the individual's right to attend lectures, and the loss of student status subsequently categorized them as unproductive vagrants, subject to immediate deportation. The state prioritized the confessional purity of the lecture halls over the preservation of the city's scientific and medical potential, a shift that forced hundreds of promising researchers and laboratory assistants to abandon their studies mid-semester. Furthermore, the academic exile targeted the Moscow Conservatory and the Petrovskaya Agricultural Academy, institutions that had once been the primary vehicles for Jewish cultural assimilation. The Ministry of the Interior argued that the oversaturation of these fields with alien elements undermined the career prospects of the Orthodox gentry, framing the removal of Jewish students as a restorative measure for the true Russian youth. This policy of academic protectionism ensured that the intellectual capital developed by the Jewish community was physically extracted from the Russian heartland and relocated to the western provinces or foreign universities. The state's refusal to recognize academic merit as a basis for residency marked the total abandonment of the Petrine-style meritocracy in favor of a genealogical caste system. The administrative aftermath within the universities was characterized by a precipitous decline in research output and a goods deficit in the city's technical sectors. The scientific cleansing of Moscow's higher learning institutions effectively terminated the pipeline of skilled intermediaries that had bridged the gap between the Russian center and the European periphery. By the winter of 1891, the academic landscape of Moscow had been fundamentally reconfigured. The once diverse corridors of the Imperial University were transformed into a space of uniform loyalty, where the absence of Jewish scholars served as a visible testament to the state's victory over the reformist mirage of the previous century. Consequently, the 1891 expulsion achieved a total intellectual segregation, ensuring that the ancient capital remained a closed, confessional enclave for the production of the empire's future elite. The administrative progression of the 1891 expulsion was met with a structured, albeit ultimately ineffective, resistance from the Russian industrial elite, who utilized petitions of state utility to warn the throne of an impending systemic fiscal contraction. These petitions, primarily orchestrated through the Moscow Stock Exchange Committee, Moskovsky Birjovoy Komitet, moved beyond humanitarian concerns to present a quantified analysis of the nedobor, or revenue shortfall, that would result from the immediate removal of the city's primary intermediary class. Russian textile magnates and heavy industrialists, including the Morozov and Knup dynasties, argued that the Jewish mercantile networks were not parasitic competitors, but essential distributive links that connected Moscow's manufacturing centers to the peripheral markets of the Balkans, Persia, and the Far East. By framing their residency as a strategic economic necessity, these industrialists sought to exploit the state's chronic dependence on liquid tax revenue to secure a stay of execution for their commercial partners. A central theme of these petitions was the disruption of the Kreditnaya Tsep, or credit chain, which underpinned the seasonal procurement of raw cotton and wool. The Stock Exchange Committee submitted a formal memorandum to the Ministry of Finance, then led by Ivan Vishnegradsky, detailing how the sudden extraction of Jewish brokers would lead to a total freeze in the circulation of vexelia, bills of exchange. These documents emphasized that the Russian gosti lacked the specialized linguistic skills and the decentralized kinship networks required to manage the high-risk credit environments of the borderland provinces. The industrialists argued that the resulting commercial vacuum would lead to a precipitous decline in the aktsiz, excise collections, and the promysloviy nalog, industrial tax, which were the primary sources of funding for the empire's railway expansion and military modernization. The petitions presented a vision of pragmatic imperialism, where the economic sovereignty of the state was viewed as being contingent upon the preservation of its most efficient commercial agents, regardless of their confessional status. Furthermore, the petitions addressed the logistical paralysis that would follow the liquidation of the Zaryadye wholesale depots. Industrialists from the Prokhorov and Kludov firms noted that the Jewish agencies in Moscow acted as the primary clearinghouses for over 60% of the city's manufactured exports. They warned that without these intermediaries, the skladsky zapasy, warehouse stocks, of Moscow's factories would remain stagnant, leading to a localized overproduction crisis and the subsequent layoff of thousands of Orthodox laborers. This was a strategic attempt to link the welfare of the indigenous Russian worker to the continued residency of the Jewish useful categories, creating a narrative where the expulsion was portrayed as a threat to the internal stability of the gentry-owned industries. The petitions also highlighted the risk to the tamozhenie poshliny, customs duties, as the removal of Jewish importers would effectively terminate the lucrative transit trade of European luxury goods through the Moscow Customs House. The response from the Ministry of Interior, however, reflected the total dominance of the national protectionist ideology over fiscal pragmatism. Minister Durnovo and the Governor-General's Chancellery categorized these industrial petitions as mercenary pleadings that prioritized short-term profit over the higher interests of the autocracy. The state's formal rejection of these memorandums asserted that the temporary economic stagnation was a necessary sacrifice for the purification of the national market. The Romanov administration utilized the Committee of Ministers to override the warnings of the Moscow Stock Exchange, reinforcing the principle that the ideological homogeneity of the capital superseded the measurable utility of its commercial subjects. By late 1891, the failure of these petitions confirmed that the social contract of productivity had been entirely replaced by a mandate of exclusion. The industrialists' warnings of a tax shortfall were realized in the following fiscal year, but the state's commitment to the expulsion remained unshakable, finalizing the transition of Moscow into a closed, state-managed economy where the laws of the market were subordinate to the decrees of the throne. The definitive rejection of all appeals for clemency during the 1891 expulsion was anchored in the personal political philosophy of Alexander III, who viewed the autocratic will as an instrument of divine mandate that could not be compromised by secular economic considerations. While previous Romanov monarchs had occasionally succumbed to the pragmatic arguments of the Ministry of Finance, the 1891 event was characterized by an institutional inflexibility that prioritized the ideological goals of the state over the stability of the international credit markets. The emperor's personal stance was codified through his marginalia on ministerial reports, where he frequently dismissed warnings of fiscal ruin with the assertion that the spiritual integrity of the Russian heartland was a non-negotiable sovereign interest. This unyielding posture effectively terminated the traditional culture of petition and response, replacing it with a unilateral executive command that recognized no internal or external opposition. A primary historical manifestation of this resolve was the throne's response to the 1891 Rothschild protest. As the news of the Moscow displacement reached the European financial centers, the House of Rothschild in Paris utilized its position as a primary creditor to the Russian state to demand a suspension of the expulsion as a condition for a new 500 million franc loan. Rather than engaging in fiscal diplomacy, Alexander III and his finance minister, Ivan Vishnegradsky, chose to accept a significant budgetary shortfall and the subsequent failure of the loan rather than permit foreign interference in domestic demographic policy. The Tsar's response, circulated among the imperial diplomatic corps, asserted that Russia does not sell its internal regulations for foreign gold, a statement that finalized the state's transition toward a policy of economic autarky. This rejection demonstrated that the Romanov administration was prepared to face a systemic liquidity crisis to ensure the fulfillment of the purification mandate in Moscow. The throne's inflexibility was also directed at the internal gentry opposition, members of the liberal aristocracy who attempted to secure exemptions for specific Jewish researchers or long-term residents were met with a standardized non-admission policy at the imperial chancellery. The state utilized the Secret Committee of Ministers to ensure that no individual petitions reached the sovereign, creating an administrative barrier that prevented the traditional mercy of the Tsar from being invoked. This was a strategic departure from the 18th century model of absolute rule, as it utilized a modern, faceless bureaucracy to enforce an ancient exclusionary dogma. The unyielding throne thus became a symbol of a new, radicalized autocracy that viewed any form of negotiation with a targeted minority as a sign of sovereign weakness. By late 1891, the imperial court had successfully decoupled the Jewish question from the general legal code, treating it as an exceptional matter of state security, where the usual rules of judicial appeal were entirely suspended. Furthermore, the rejection of clemency was reinforced by the Gazette of the Imperial Court, which published official condemnations of those who sought to obstruct the national purification. This rhetoric served to isolate the remaining integrationist factions within the Russian bureaucracy, effectively criminalizing the act of intercession. The state's refusal to recognize the mercantile utility of the Moscow community ensured that the 1891 event was finalized as a totalizing demographic extraction. The unbending will of the emperor provided the psychological momentum for the Moscow police to continue the midnight raids and the forced liquidations without fear of a sudden counterorder. Consequently, the 1891 expulsion was completed not as a negotiated settlement, but as a pure expression of samodержавие, the absolute, unchecked power of the autocrat to reorder the demographic reality of his empire regardless of the material cost to the treasury. This chapter of the expulsion confirms that, by the final months of the year, the throne had successfully achieved a state of ideological isolation, leaving the Moscow community without a single legal or diplomatic avenue for survival. The logistical execution of the 1891 mandate necessitated the conversion of Moscow's railway perimeters into specialized transit zones, where the authority of the municipal police intersected with the military jurisdiction of the railway gendarmerie. These zones, primarily centered around the Brest and Yaroslavl stations, functioned as high-density administrative filters where the Открытие list, open sheet, was subjected to a final pogren control, frontier check, before boarding. The Ministry of Ways and Communications issued a specific deportation tariff in May 1891, which mandated the use of third-class carriages or modified freight cars, known as teplushki, for the transport of the expelled population. These stations became sites of bureaucratic compression as the evacuation committee's daily quotas forced thousands into restricted holding areas not designed for prolonged habitation. This spatial strategy was intended to prevent the recirculation of refugees back into the city center by creating a one-way pipeline from the urban interior to the railway tracks. Within these transit zones, the Baggage Commission enforced rigid weight restrictions, typically limited to 30 poods per family, which served as a final asset filter. Items exceeding this limit were classified as commercial cargo and subjected to prohibitive transit taxes, forcing families to abandon their remaining household effects on the platforms. The Moscow Governor General's Chancellery utilized the station inspectorate to verify that no individual possessed prohibited professional tools, such as industrial molds, which were legally required to remain within the Moscow jurisdiction. This oversight ensured that the community departed not only as a demographic mass, but as a decapitalized labor force. The administrative management of these zones was overseen by Otriadnie Komandiri, detachment commanders, who operated outside the civil code, applying a military-style regimen of movement to all residents entering the station gates. The Sanitary Police Inspectorate conducted perfunctory medical screenings to identify epidemiological risks that might disrupt the railway schedule. However, these inspections were secondary to the census verification process, where the police cross-referenced the departing families against the secret registers. The transit zones functioned as the terminal point of the professionalization of surveillance, where the data collected during the years of residence was used to confirm the total extraction of each targeted category. Any individual whose documentation was incomplete was transferred to stationary detention, a form of administrative limbo that prevented them from both leaving the city and returning to their homes. This created a condition of spatial paralysis at the city's outskirts, where legal personhood was suspended in favor of status as a transit unit. By the autumn of 1891, the railway stations had evolved into permanent logistical frontiers, with dedicated platforms assigned to the expulsion convoys. The Gendarmeskoye Upravlenie, Gendarme Administration, coordinated the echelon convoy schedules to ensure the influx of refugees into the Pale did not exceed the capacity of the borderland stations. This coordination was finalized through a telegraphic dispatch system, which alerted Western governors of the arrival of each specific demographic tier. The transit zones represented the final physical barrier between Moscow and the Pale, turning the city's suburban threshold into a site of mechanical efficiency. Consequently, the establishment of these holding areas achieved the total territorial decoupling of the Jewish population, ensuring that the departure was managed with the same bureaucratic rigor that had characterized the preceding liquidation phase. The physical departure of the Moscow Jewish population in 1891 represented a massive demographic injection into the western frontier of the Russian Empire, an event categorized by the Ministry of the Interior as a return to the Pale. This movement was managed through the Echelon convoy system, where the Ministry of Ways and Communications coordinated with the Governor-General's office to maintain the physical flow of thousands across the interior frontier boundary. Unlike the self-directed migrations of the 1860s, the 1891 exodus was a forced re-territorialization, conducted under the continuous supervision of the railway gendarmerie. The primary rail arteries, the Moscow-Brest and Moscow-Kiev lines, became the conduits for a community that had been legally and physically severed from the Russian heartland. This phase of the expulsion was not merely a change of location, but a structural dislocation, as urbanized professionals were reintroduced into the economic environment of the Pale of Settlement, which was already suffering from acute land hunger and industrial saturation. The reception of these refugees in the western gubernias was governed by the Statute on the Settlement of Arriving Jews, a series of local administrative orders that sought to manage the sudden density in cities such as Warsaw, Vilna, and Minsk. The provincial governors of the Pale, already struggling with the restrictive legacy of the 1882 May laws, viewed the Moscow influx as an administrative burden that threatened to collapse the regional welfare systems and communal charities. Because the departing families had been stripped of their liquid capital through the liquidation and extortion phases, they entered the western provinces as proletarianized subjects, lacking the resources to establish new workshops or retail outlets. This created an immediate urban crisis within the Pale, where the sudden surplus of skilled labor, tailors, shoemakers, and clockmakers, led to a precipitous decline in regional wages and a spike in local poverty levels. The exodus to the west also signaled the terminal failure of the imperial integrationist policy, as the arrival of the Moscow exiles in borderland cities provided visual proof that the right of residence was a temporary administrative grant rather than a civil protection. This realization catalyzed a shift in the community's strategic outlook, moving from internal Russian acculturation to international emigration. The transit pipeline that started at the Moscow stations often did not terminate within the Pale. Instead, it fed directly into the broader emigration infrastructure, linking the Russian frontier to the ports of Hamburg and Bremen. The 1891 event thus functioned as a demographic trigger, accelerating the massive wave of departures toward Western Europe and the United States. The state's effort to compress the population into the Pale inadvertently turned the western borderlands into a staging ground for a global diaspora. By the winter of 1891, the physical removal was finalized, leaving the western cities of the empire to absorb a population legally barred from returning eastward. The geographic containment achieved by the Romanov administration resulted in a permanent alteration of the demographic map, where the interior provinces were effectively purified at the cost of destabilizing the western frontier. The exodus represented the perfection of territorial policing, where the mechanical efficiency of the railway was used to enforce a policy of total social exclusion. This movement concluded the community's existence as a Muscovite entity, transforming it into a displaced population, defined by the trauma of its sudden removal from the imperial center. The 1891 exodus thus stands as the definitive operational success of the reactionary state, marking the moment when the Moscow exception was replaced by a permanent, westernized confinement. The immediate consequence of the 1891 expulsion was the onset of a systemic commercial paralysis within Moscow's primary trading rows, a phenomenon characterized by credit inelasticity. For decades, the Jewish merchantry of the Zariadye had functioned as the essential financial lubricant of the city's wholesale economy, operating through a high-velocity system of informal credit and vexelia, bills of exchange, that the traditional Russian banking sector was unequipped to replicate. When the March Mandate physically extracted these intermediaries, it did not merely remove a demographic group. It liquidated the very infrastructure of short-term lending that allowed small and medium-sized Russian firms to procure raw materials and distribute finished goods. The hollowed marketplaces became a literal reality in the Kitai-Gorod, where the sudden vacancy of over 2,000 commercial leases resulted in a precipitous drop in municipal rental income and a total freeze in the circulation of liquid capital. The Moscow Merchant Society, which had lobbied aggressively for the removal of their competitors, found itself structurally incapable of filling the resulting mercantile vacuum. The Orthodox Kupečesko-Soslovie merchant estate was traditionally characterized by a conservative investment strategy, prioritizing fixed assets and landed property over the high-risk, low-margin intermediary trade that had defined the Jewish commercial model. Historical data from the Moscow Stock Exchange, Birza, indicates that in the months following the exodus, the volume of secondary wholesale transactions fell by nearly 50%. This was due to the knowledge deficit among the remaining Russian guilds, who lacked the multilingual proficiency and the decentralized kinship networks required to manage the logistics of the empire's peripheral markets. Without the Jewish agents who had previously bridged the gap between the Moscow factories and the rural consumers of the Pale and Central Asia, the supply chain for textiles and leather goods effectively collapsed. This commercial stagnation triggered an industrial overproduction crisis within the Moscow gubernia. Textile magnates who had supported the purification on ideological grounds discovered that their warehouses were accumulating massive skladsky zapasy, unpurchased stocks, because the retail pipeline had been dismantled. The Russian guilds attempted to establish new Orthodox cooperatives to manage distribution, but these institutions lacked the trust-based credit that had allowed Jewish firms to operate with minimal collateral. Consequently, the cost of procurement for provincial retailers spiked as the remaining Moscow wholesalers demanded immediate cash payments, a requirement that the cash-poor agrarian economy could not satisfy. This resulted in localized inflation for consumer goods across the Russian interior, effectively penalizing the very Orthodox population the state had intended to protect. The economic contraction of 1892 was documented by the Ministry of Finance as a temporary market correction, yet the reality was a permanent loss of Moscow's competitive edge as a regional trading hub. The hollowing extended beyond the stalls of the Zaryadye to the city's fiscal institutions, where the sudden withdrawal of Jewish deposits and the nullification of their outstanding debts led to a localized banking crisis. The state's protectionist intervention had successfully achieved a confessional monopoly, but at the cost of creating a static market where the absence of competition led to a decline in innovation and a rise in administrative corruption. By the winter following the expulsion, the silence of the Glebovskoye Podvorye served as a physical testament to the failure of the national economy to replace the complex, integrated networks of the displaced community. The 1891 event thus finalized the transition of Moscow from a vibrant polyglot commercial center into a protected but economically stagnant heartland. The physical manifest of the community's spiritual presence in Moscow was centered on the Choral Synagogue in Bolshoi Spasoglinischevsky Lane, a monumental structure designed by architect Simon Ibushitz to reflect the prestige of the integrationist era. However, as the 1891 expulsion decimated the congregation, the building's architectural prominence became a focal point of municipal hostility. The Moscow administration, citing the Building Code of 1888, argued that the synagogue's high dome constituted a visual intrusion that competed with the traditional cupolas of the nearby Orthodox churches. Under direct orders from the Governor-General's Chancellery, the congregation was forced to remove the dome and the Star of David emblems, an act of architectural emasculation intended to reduce the building's religious identity to that of an anonymous civic structure. This modification served as a physical precedent for the juridical desacralization of non-Christian spaces within the city center, ensuring that no non-Orthodox landmark could challenge the skyline of the ancient capital. The formal closure of the synagogue in 1892 was executed through the Statute on Communal Dissolution, which stipulated that a religious building could only remain active if it served a statutory minimum of registered resident families. Because the preceding expulsion had stripped thousands of their residency stamps, the Moscow Jewish community could no longer satisfy this demographic requirement. The Ministry of the Interior utilized this numeric technicality to revoke the building's occupancy permit, effectively seizing the property as an abandoned asset. The communal records, including the metrical books and the treasury ledgers, were confiscated by the secret chancellery to prevent the establishment of any shadow administration that might assist those attempting to remain in the city illegally. This institutional seizure achieved a crucial objective: the removal of the last centralized node of communal solidarity, leaving the remaining residents without a legal space for assembly. Following the closure, the building was repurposed as a home for the destitute, Nuzdayushchiksia, and a vocational school for Orthodox youth, a transformation that the reactionary press lauded as the restoration of the site's national utility. This repurposing was managed by the Moscow City Duma, which allocated municipal funds to renovate the interior for secular use, ensuring that all vestiges of the original liturgy were removed or plastered over. The conversion of a monumental house of worship into a charitable shelter for the native population was a calculated symbolic act of ecclesiastical replacement, demonstrating that the state recognized no permanent right to non-Orthodox communal property in the imperial capital. The building's status was changed from a Moleni Dom, house of prayer, to a Blagotvoritelnoe Zavedenie, charitable institution in the city's cadastral registers, a move that finalized the legal erasure of the community's spiritual presence. The sequestration of the synagogue remained in effect for over a decade, with the structure serving as a visible reminder of the 1891 solution. The state's refusal to permit even a private chapel within the walls of the former synagogue ensured that the remaining elite families were denied a space for communal organization. This policy of spiritual decentralization aimed to prevent the resurgence of a unified Jewish public voice in Moscow, compelling the remaining residents to meet in small, unregistered private apartments that were subject to the midnight raids of the police. It was not until the 1905 October Manifesto that the lock on the sanctuary was legally challenged, but for the duration of the 1890s, the repurposed building stood as a monument to the triumph of confessional exclusivity. The conversion finalized the topographical purification of Moscow, confirming that the state had successfully reclaimed the urban landscape for the sole use of the Orthodox social order. The 1891 displacement in Moscow functioned as the geopolitical engine for the most significant surge in Jewish transoceanic migration recorded in the 19th century, fundamentally altering the demographic composition of the Atlantic world. While previous emigrations from the Russian Empire had been steady but manageable, the specific targeting of the Moscow professional and mercantile classes created a high-velocity diaspora that bypassed the traditional internal absorption mechanisms of the Pale of Settlement. Statistical records from the United States Bureau of Immigration indicate that 1891 marked a historic peak, with the number of Jewish arrivals from Russia nearly tripling from the previous fiscal year, reaching over 76,000 individuals in a single 12-month interval. This was the first time that the Romanov administration's internal police actions directly dictated the urban development of foreign metropolitan centers like New York, London, and Buenos Aires. This international migration was facilitated by the emergence of the steamship pipeline, dominated by the Hamburg-America Line and the North German Lloyd, which established a specialized transit infrastructure to handle the influx of refugees at the ports of Hamburg and Bremen. The 1891 event catalyzed the formation of the Jewish Colonization Association, ICA, chartered in London by Baron Maurice de Hirsch, with an initial endowment of £2 million. The ICA's objective was the systematic geographic reallocation of the displaced population to agricultural colonies in Argentina and Brazil, a project that treated the Moscow exiles as a mobile labor force for the South American frontier. This represented the professionalization of global philanthropy, where the private capital of the European banking elite was utilized to manage a demographic crisis that the Russian state refused to acknowledge. In the United States, the sudden influx of Moscow refugees prompted a fundamental shift in federal policy, leading to the enactment of the Immigration Act of 1891. This legislation established the Office of the Superintendent of Immigration and formalized the medical and financial screening processes at Ellis Island to manage the Russian inundation. The American Diplomatic Corps, led by Minister Charles Emery Smith in St. Petersburg, issued formal reports characterizing the expulsion as an unfriendly act of social dumping, whereby the Romanov state exported its perceived social problems to the American tax base. This created a new era of migration diplomacy, where the internal regulations of the Moscow Governor General became a recurring point of friction in Russian-American trade negotiations. The impact was equally pronounced in the United Kingdom, where the concentration of Moscow artisans in the Whitechapel and Spitalfields districts of London triggered the first modern debates regarding alien immigration. The British House of Commons established a select committee to investigate the socio-economic effects of the influx, a process that eventually led to the drafting of the Aliens Act of 1905. The global shockwave thus produced a paradox. While the Russian state achieved its goal of national purification in Moscow, it inadvertently created a highly organized, politically active diaspora that utilized its new jurisdictions to lobby against the Romanov autocracy. By the end of 1891, the Moscow community had transitioned from a localized Russian minority to a constituent part of a global network, ensuring that the legacy of the expulsion was documented and publicized in the legislative chambers of the West. This finalized the transformation of a municipal police action into a landmark event of international demographic history, marking the terminal point of the community's domestic isolation. The long-term legacy of the 1891 expulsion was codified in the results of the 1897 General Imperial Census, the first comprehensive demographic survey of the Russian state, which documented a Moscow that had successfully achieved cadastral uniformity at the expense of its previous economic complexity. The census data revealed that the Jewish population of the city had been reduced to a mere fraction of its pre-1891 levels, with the remaining 8,000 residents confined strictly to the highest tiers of the First Merchant Guild and the state-vetted professional classes. This numerical reduction signaled the terminal success of the Romanov administration's effort to convert the ancient capital into a sacral bureaucratic center, where the physical absence of non-orthodox commercial agents was viewed as the primary indicator of national stability. The silence of Moscow referred not to a lack of activity, but to the removal of the competitive friction and credit-based dynamism that had once characterized the Zaryadye, replaced by a state-managed economic order that prioritized ideological conformity over market efficiency. The structural impact of this homogeneity was the emergence of autarkic stagnation, where the Moscow marketplace became increasingly isolated from the international textile and hardware networks that the displaced intermediaries had previously navigated. By 1893, the Ministry of Finance recorded the rise of state-sanctioned syndicates, such as the Prodamet and Prodmet conglomerates, which filled the vacuum left by the Jewish merchant houses but operated through rigid price fixing and government subsidies. These monopolies lacked the decentralized agility of the Wechsel, bill of exchange system, leading to a capital siltation where the city's wealth was concentrated in a few hundred gentry-owned firms. The loss of the Jewish middle market distribution layer effectively truncated the city's economic reach, transforming Moscow from a potential global financial hub into a localized protectionist depot. The municipal treasury attempted to offset the loss of commercial tax revenue by increasing the kvartirny nalog, apartment tax, on the remaining population, a move that exacerbated the rising cost of urban living. Furthermore, the 1891 event served as a legislative template for the professionalization of internal passports and residency restrictions across the remaining interior gubernias. The Moscow model of categorical extraction demonstrated to the imperial bureaucracy that the total removal of an integrated social class could be achieved without triggering a general urban insurrection, provided the state maintained control over the transit infrastructure. This provided the psychological and administrative blueprint for the more radical population transfers of the early 20th century, establishing a precedent for the juridical erasure of entire demographics in the interest of state security. The Zaryadye district, once the most densely populated and commercially active zone in the capital, remained in a state of managed vacancy for years, with many of the Glebovskoye Podvorye warehouses repurposed as police barracks or municipal storage depots. The silence of Moscow also marked the end of the Slavic-Jewish synthesis that had defined the city's intellectual life during the mid-century reforms. The removal of the professional and academic elite ensured that the Moscow of the 1890s was a city of uniform loyalty, where the university and the courtroom were no longer sites of pluralistic debate, but were instead echo chambers for the reactionary autocracy. The state's achievement of demographic homogeneity created a hollowed mercantile frontier, where the city's symbolic role as the heart of orthodoxy was maintained at the cost of its technical and fiscal vitality. By the turn of the century, the 1891 expulsion was viewed by the Romanov court as a definitive triumph of the national idea.